Tim Wess. Tim is the Deputy Academic Vice Chancellor of the University of the Sunshine Coast. Prior to his current position, he was the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Science at Charles Sturt University in New South Wales. His previous academic roles in the United Kingdom have included Pro-Vice Chancellor of Cardiff University, co-opted council member of the University of Wales, Newport, and head of the School of Optometry and Vision Sciences at Cardiff University. Tim's research is focused on the characterization of biomaterials using large-scale infrastructure such as synchrotron and neutron sources. He has published more than 100 papers on the structure of collagen, elastic proteins, and bone. His recent work has included studying the change of biomaterials in the context of cultural heritage and archaeological research. Social justice and equity have been strong components of Professor Wess's work in and beyond the higher education sector. Tim is going to be speaking about resurfacing Indigenous art and artifacts, inclusion, acceptance, and exclusion. Please join me in thanking Tim.
Mawangu, Jennifer. Yiradu marang, muji, balga balga, nade dugu gubara, leni lenape mine, nurumbangbu, Mawangu. So that's an acknowledgement of the Lenni Lenape peoples on land we are here today, but I've done it in Wiradjuri language, which I've been studying in Australia. And so I'm going to come back to this picture here at the end, and I'm just trying to work out how I advance the slides. I guess it's the bit that's worn out completely. Before we get too serious, I think that one of the things is she's the Balga, don't mess with this woman. Okay. From the 2016 Gordon conference, a few of us went off to the Wilhelm Reich house here, and Patricia was born in Wagga Wagga, and I lived in Wagga Wagga at the time, and so we turned up and said, we're the biggest contingency that you've ever had from Wagga Wagga, and we were sort of asking for special demands and to be trapped inside this house. So it was just, I thought it was just a bit of fun before I get serious, if that's okay. Because what I'm going to talk about today really is fraught. I'm going to talk about two stories, and interesting in the way that I found out about them, but it's really just looking at this tension in Australia between essentially black people and white privileged people, and two worlds that either layer and collide or crash. And it's the word that I've come. Anybody who thinks they have a solution, anybody who says all they have to, is also already divisive, and it's just fraught. The word I continually come up with is just fraught. So the two stories, the first one that people might have heard about is Mungo Man. There's Mungo Man and Mungo Woman that were found out in the Willandra Lakes, and what was interesting about Mungo Man is that you can see the ochre in the skeleton. The skeleton's been laid very purposefully, and politically, what this meant was that when Cook arrived and declared that Australia was terra nullius, that was because the people there there were no people there, and they had no right to be there, they had no ceremony, they had no ritual, they had no home, they were just migrant. This proved different in terms of that. So that's one of the parts I'm going to talk about, and I'm not going to talk really that much about the bones. I'm going to talk about just what effect it's had on communities. The other one is a collection, and it's funny, I was just talking to Marco about the Brisbane Exhibition Centre, and this is from the Brisbane Convention Centre. It's really a situation of these paintings and these chairs, and I'm going to come back to the significance of that in terms of Australia's view of the world and the way that the world views Australia. Everybody with me so far? Okay, so what's also in terms of... is that a pointer? Is that a pointer? We'll make it work. Sorry, I don't know how to make it work. No, is that working? I don't have to make that work. So, oh. Darwin's up here. I now live here in the University of the Sunshine Coast. Used to live over here, halfway between Sydney and Melbourne, so that's where Wagga Wagga is. Would you agree with that? Yeah, that's right, all right. So the bones I'm talking about are coming from here, and the paintings I'm talking about are coming from this region here. And the fact that the paintings I'm talking about came from here, but are being displayed here, is also another point of interest. And if you start to look at Australia, then there are different ways of viewing it. And before, I've been in Australia 6 years, and I had no idea before I moved out. This is the language groups that actually still exist in Australia. There are pretty 3 times this number of language groups in Australia. And the languages I was just speaking to you in came from the language areas almost relates to the ketosis of the land, where you've got the mountains and the valleys, groups are far more isolated, when you've got these bigger plains, when you can actually move out far more. And the fantastic thing as well about a lot of the languages is that the way in which they distinguish the languages is how people say no. So we're actually, that I was speaking to you in, means this is how we say no. So wirai means no. Wirajuri is how we say no. When you get to a different language barrier, there's people saying, we don't say no like that. We say nyumpa, that is how we say no. So that's how those differences, the distinctions are. There is some similarity between the languages, but this cultural distinction actually makes interacting with Indigenous peoples very, very difficult. There is no single spokesperson really for a lot of these people. And so the first part that I was going to talk about is this 3 traditional owners, three First Nations, you might call them out here, the Pakenji, the Muti Muti, and the Nyimpa. Like I was saying, I know that Nyimpa is how that tribal group say no to distinguish themselves from the interface with Wiradjuri. And what I'm going to talk about actually comes from sitting around in Lake Mungo on the edges of these with this white ochre here, which we've been out collecting, that was being used on that sand sculptures I was showing earlier. This guy here, do people actually recognise this? This was the CNN reporter for the Gulf War, a guy called Stan Grant, and his father was the one who taught me Wiradjuri back in Wagga Wagga. Stan is incredibly well known. He's probably the most famous Indigenous person in Australia. And we were out with him talking about what's going on in the lakes, what's going on in terms of how we can strengthen communities through a connection with the land. I just thought that if there's ever going to be an album cover, he's a big Clash fan, I'm a big Clash fan. If we ever got a band, that would be the album cover, I think, in terms of that. But we live in hope. So the bit I wanted to point out is that culturally, these 3 groups have actually got on for quite a long time. Possibly tens of thousands of years. They've tolerated each other, lived together. They have a distinction, they have the language distinction, but they're actually being okay. And it's Mungo Man has actually produced differences between them. So that's what in terms of active materials, I'm talking about how something is discovered and appropriated and reappropriated, and what the effect and the cultural effect of that is. But it's an amazing piece of country, and it is hundreds of miles from the next biggest town. And it was sitting around as well. There's this guy here who got me into it is called Jeff Simpson. He's an absolutely brilliant musician, but also he was incredibly kind letting me into. He's actually not Wiradjuri, he's Gamilaroi, but he lives in Wiradjuri country. And we're all out on Muti Muti Nyumpa country, sitting around, and actually it was this kind of what they call yarning circles, where we began to understand each other about what it is that we were doing. Mal Ridges here is an incredible guy. He's an archaeologist, but he works with Indigenous people in a way that what I'm about to talk to you about really hasn't occurred. So the guy who actually discovered Mungo Man and the significance of Mungo Man and Mungo Woman, which occurred in 1968 and 1974, was that Jim Bowler was actually a geologist. Because these lakes, they're a dried up lake system, were being eroded, he then identified these bones and he discovered these bones. And that's the very interesting part, is this concept of discovery versus reveal. I use the word reveal in my time because the indigenous people believe that the bones were revealed to somebody, they weren't discovered by some, and that goes down to a whole thing of approach of philosophy and control over nature. But here's Jim, and nobody asked the local Aboriginals about whether these bones could be taken off from what they realised was the significance wasn't that somebody just dropped dead in the desert and there they were and we picked up their bones. This is a significant site of burial, and which showed culture, and it was still okay to take the bones. But when you actually go back, Aboriginal Australians, Aboriginal actually means like of the flora, and so these people only were given a vote in 1962. So to actually ask their opinion 6 years later was probably seen by most people as actually as irrelevant. But there's Jim getting those bones up. And what happened? The bones were taken away, whisked away to the Australian National University, where they were kept for 50 years, and they were stored, brought out. Somebody did some work to say and found the mitochondrial DNA, and therefore came up with a whole theory and a whole career for themselves, I presume, about how the Mungo man was not actually out of Africa, etc., etc. Turned out to be the scientist's own mitochondrial DNA in the end. All of these things were occurring, but as far as the Muti and the Nyumpa people, it wasn't occurring, and they were trying to get the bones back. And it turns out they were just asking the wrong person. Eventually, they got to the Vice-Chancellor, who had no idea that everybody else... I've got to be careful, this is being recorded. Had no idea that this pushback was occurring, and the process of actually getting the bones back began to occur. Now, Mungo Woman had already been brought back. But actually, in trying to find out about all of this, the amount of fake news that I've had to sift through, and I've actually, because I've wanted to use a lot of public information, it's my own pictures as well that I'm showing. It's been incredibly fraught just trying to find out what actually has happened. And Jeff, who I showed you earlier, was part of this ceremony, so it was decided that the bones would be taken back from the Australian National University in Canberra. I've got 3 kids who've just been at ANU, and there was a funeral cortege, there was a special cask made, and this was a really big news story, and the cortege stopped in Wagga Wagga overnight. My friend Jeff was the curator for the bones overnight. What they were taking them back to this area of the Willandra Lakes, and this is the reception ceremony as well. And for many people there, the news story stops. But there's a couple of different quotes here in terms of this antithesis. This is, and I just thought there's a good Australian swear word in the middle of this as well. So this is Jim's view after some of his own enlightenment. Is everybody just about through it? Yeah. The bit that gets me, you see, is this bit where there are value judgments even in the statement where he, after all these years, is actually trying to sort of have some contrition against what's happened. But his career's been built out of this. But, talking about people having purely rational minds, in contrast to what Indigenous Aboriginal people are on about, to me gives a contrast in terms of their deeply held religious beliefs, where Biame, as the sort of ultimate god, reveals these things to people, is now being sort of, even in the best intentions, is still, I think, not hitting the mark in actually having some cultural sympathy, some cultural way. It's fraught. And then from one of the Muti elders, then the bit that I've highlighted here is about, she wants the repatriation to be a unifying moment. 40,000 years. But it's this part as well. This is about the reveal. because he's a remarkable person. He's done his job. It's time for him to go now and rest. And this is where you get to some of the fake news, because some of the news items then say, and yes, Mungo Man is buried and is sitting in the Willandra Lakes, and it's all now finished. There has been such arguments between those tribal groups. So I need to go to the next slide. In terms of the three traditional owners. So this is interesting as a picture, because this is Jim Bowler standing next to Warren, who is a guy I know out at the lakes, and it's interesting, they're standing together, and there's a bit of it's symbolic, but there's a little bit of a distance here, because there was a management group for Mungo Lady and Mungo Man, and that group's dissolved, and it hasn't come together, and it hasn't been reenacted. And this is where I've got to be very careful about the fact this is being recorded and I'm speaking publicly, because the relationships between these groups is not the same as it was because of the repatriation of Mungo Man and the agreement about where it's going to be stored. The bones, as far as I know, from speaking to people who I think do know, the bones are stored in the visitor centre in a cabinet which has two keys, one that's owned by the traditional owners, one that's owned by the scientists, and neither can access without the other one's permission, and that's where it's got to at the moment. I don't know. The scientists are saying there's still information we could get. It's very important we can still access the information. Other people are saying, actually, you've had enough of this, and one of ours, who actually was the founding fathers of our nation, should be able to go to rest. And it's interesting that I'm now moving over to some of the attitudes that there are, though, that still go on. Because La Trobe University, we've got good friends at La Trobe University, put out some bones, and people are picking them up. So the respect that we're hoping that, this site, it's hard to imagine, this lake site there are just fires all over the place that have been there for tens of thousands of years. There are just fire sites that are still there. You could just pick up artifacts all over the place. And one of the things that the visitor centre, this very small visitor centre, is these are letters that people who've picked up artifacts and then decided that they need to return them have actually are put out there in a display case. And it's fascinating because I don't know whether people think they're hexed or whether there's something going on, but it's the best display that I've seen to actually try to stop people taking artifacts. I think there's been a few studies about this, but it's still going on. People don't respect this as a site. They think it's something for them to go and get a tourist memento from. So there's a long way to go. And I'd actually written this talk, which is very unusual for me to have even thought about it before I sort of sit at the back of the lecture theatre. But in the Times Higher that esteemed journal, the Times Higher Education Supplement, that I found last week this article. And this is a bit of a ho-ho article about a bones from a skeleton coming out of a Kurdish area where this guy is, 90,000 years old, and it's a career-defining moment. So I've just taken this bit here but the bit that hit me really was just how difficult it was to get those bones home. With home being the divisive word in terms of, because the question is, it's written from such a sort of slightly jolly, here's a bit of a cartoon, Western paradigm of who's right and who deserves to have these bones. And it bangs on about getting a passport for return, and, the locals are a bit annoyed that these bones are being taken out, but hey-ho, we know best, etc., etc. So I actually wrote, like you've been writing, Ben, I wrote to this, I got the out of office from the person who wrote this article, because I said, have you learned nothing? Do you know nothing in terms of what was going on in terms of repatriation? So that's just, I thought it was interesting that it's still going on. And today in the news, there's the articles from Easter Island that are being returned from the Norwegians. So it's just something that we're getting to understand more. But the conditionality that we have still seems to be extreme about what our Western values of what we can do with other people who don't quite know as much as we do, and the framework that they understand. So that's just gives me, you can absorb this while I'm talking to you. How am I doing for time? Absolutely. Oh dear. The previous one was just, I was sitting down at that campfire, and that's when I got told, I was asking where one of the tribal leaders was, and he wasn't there, and it was explained to me kind of what had happened. This is another situation of just how in Australia things are not quite as they might seem. The reason why I've got these plaques up is I went to a meeting about the Medical Research Futures Fund, which is a massive fund in Australia for biomedical research, and I was asked to go along by my university. And I arrived first. And when I walked into the room I showed you earlier, I noticed on the back of all of the seats, there were the names of presidents, etc., because it was the meeting room where the G20 met in 2014 in Brisbane. So I got there first, and somebody came in to sort of put the coffee out, and I asked them about this, and that's how they explained to me about the context of the room. So you've got Merkel, Putin. I just went around taking photos of these on another visit because I didn't understand the significance. So this is the room. So what's interesting is that when Australia wants to show the world what it's about, what does it represent Australia with? Indigenous artwork, okay? Everything in that room is Indigenous artwork. It's not from the area, which is a kind of cultural insensitivity, but we're representing the whole of Australia here, so I think that I can forgive that. So I started asking questions about the artwork and why it was there and what it was that happened. And I found out that the World Expo 1988 was held in Brisbane, and those artworks were part of the Australian Pavilion for Expo 1988. I can't find any pictures of those artworks in the Expo 88, but I've been told that they were there. And one of the art critics said, the most acclaimed expo at the Expo, there was a vast amount of publicity, particularly overseas. Okay? The art is represented, da-di-da-di-da, whatever, particularly overseas. Because what happened after Expo 88 is the art was taken down, frames taken off, rolled up, tried to sell it. People wanted to break up the collection. At least they didn't break up the collection because it's from one particular artist community. But then it got stored for 20 years until Australia decided again how it would actually show itself to the world at the G20 conference when the artwork came out again because it's particularly enjoyed by those people from overseas. I just thought that was quite interesting in terms of the attitude towards Indigenous art. It's beautiful. The artwork's absolutely fantastic. And I was saying I didn't want to show too many pictures because I ended up explaining about the artwork. Was really, it's just what I'm interested in the active nature is the fact that people will, get out the Indigenous art, put away the Indigenous art, get out the Indigenous art again is something that I thought was culturally just very interesting because whilst that Indigenous art was inside and being shown of what the symbolism is of Indigenous and, the cultural interest of Australia, Indigenous people who were saying that the rights that they get and the fact that they had a thing called the stolen generation when until the 70s children were taken away from Indigenous families, they're outside burning the Australian flag whilst Barack Obama's looking inside at the Indigenous artwork. So, in conclusion, what I was wanting to do was to say what I've been out, and I'm just one of many, and it's an absolute privilege for me to have been involved in this project, but out on Lake Mungo, what we're trying to do as an environmental project is to look after this bird, which is a symbolic sculpture of here, is called the malleefowl. And by getting people and actually talking to Indigenous people saying, what do you want for your communities? Not what do we think your communities need, but what do your communities want? What would be key performance indicators for your community? They want connection with country. They want purpose. So we were working with them, co-creating with them a project where through ceremony, people come out and celebrate the malleefowl and then actually work out ecological projects to keep the malleefowl. But the main thing is actually to bring the communities together in terms of very broken communities. So this is the way that I want to see fire and Indigenous culture brought together rather than the the symbolic burning of a flag. And to be out, I don't feel I'm a very spiritual person, but to be out in the middle of the night at one of these ceremonies was incredibly powerful. And I just think that photograph there of pouring the ochre onto the eye of the mallee fowl is just a beautiful photo. If you can see it okay, I can't tell whether you can see it okay. So in conclusion, the thing that I've learnt, and that I'm always saying with Indigenous peoples, is nothing about us without us. That's the absolute first tenet. You do not go and take their bones. You do not appropriate their country. You work with them. Now, the way that you work with them might not be the way that your Western science, my Western science, can actually tolerate. It's different. It's almost got to be co-design. It's got to be action learning almost in a completely different way. But this is the main thing that I talk about now in Australia, working with my university, my former university, with Indigenous communities, whether it's about artefacts, whether it's about health, but actually getting that voice understood and out there. Mawamguwu.
Thank you so much, Tim, except for the first slide. Please, do we have any questions for Tim Wess? Yes.
Question and comment. When I did a exhibition a couple years ago with the National Park Service in Chaco Canyon, and similar thing, people tend to steal things and take things away when they're visiting Native American sites. And the National Park Service actually has what they call their mea culpa collection, which is all these letters from people who have returned artifacts and shards and arrowheads with letters saying either they'd been cursed since they brought them home, they got in trouble, they were worried about getting arrested, they realized it was illegal, and they have incredible collection, and no one has done anything with this group of letters. But I find it fascinating because some graduate students I've been working with are thinking about bringing them into kind of categories and looking at, why people are compelled to return. And it was interesting how a large proportion of it was them realizing that something bad was going to happen to them as a result of taking something off of these sacred sites. And so I wonder if you can speak to that knowledge in Australia. Is how much knowledge is there about kind of the sacredness of sites and objects?
Okay, well, I suppose that one of the things that they think with Mungo Man was that, and with Mungo Woman, was that they believe that, I don't know how they, I don't know, but the ceremony of the burial was to actually, so that the ghosts didn't come and chase them. Oh. So if that's something that, I guess that but in the Lake Mungo, the Willandra Lakes Visitor Centre, I think that they would not disabuse people of the fact that it might bring bad luck to them. But I don't think people are actually actively out there doing. From a very different part of my world, because Jim was saying about, I ran a school of optometry, and selling from the chair is a big thing about persuasion. And it was interesting that in some of these circumstances, when it says do not take artifacts, people go, oh, artifacts, I'll have an artifact. I hadn't thought about taking an artifact until you told me not to. So I know that some of these people are looking at the sophistication of the messaging to see how they can actually deter people. I must admit, when I was out there, it was almost, there were so many little fire sites because people have just been there for tens of thousands of years. So they're just little fire sites all over. And I sort of went over to one, and it's almost like there's so many. What harm could it be, or whatever? But it just was really something older than Stonehenge, just sitting there. It was really kind of interesting, and I'd imagine that other, if people don't really respect Indigenous people's ways of knowing and doing, then it really would be seen as something like picking a flower, and picking a wild flower in a national park's okay, then taking these artifacts is probably okay as well. Sorry, that was somebody else. Hello. Sorry, Jen.
Yeah. We talked a lot yesterday about the secretive nature of a lot of African communities on how their ritual objects are very protected in the science and materials behind them. Do you get the sense that there's this same kind of secrecy, either in, the bones and the burial sites, or even as, some of their religious objects?
Absolutely. But I think the first thing is just respect, in a way. It's just getting that first part of respect. The other part that I think is interesting, though, is that because when you have a paucity of the lineage of a culture, then there is this opportunity to infill and to make things up. And it's Mugu, which is one of the indigenous languages, I can't remember, but it means they actually say themselves, it's shit. There's a whole industry of people going around being indigenous elders who really aren't. And it's understandable behaviour. So if they can make stuff to be hidden, then that's power. So you can kind of understand about that occurring as well. And there are some bits that are well known, and there's men's business and women's business, and I got burnt by that. And one time the Wiradjuri had a meeting, and myself and the Vice Chancellor were invited along, and it's really weird to turn up to something and then to be stopped as you're going in and told you can't come in because this is Wiradjuri business. But they must feel like that all the time in terms of exclusion. I just haven't been excluded that many times in my life, and I didn't try and find out what was going on in that room. So, but yeah, I guess it's there.
All right, please join me in thanking Tim.